FBI agent Ethan Carter, whose life is turned upside down after he's wrongfully arrested based on nothing more than his appearance. What begins as a routine mission explodes into a national battle against racial profiling and police misconduct. Facing backlash from all sides, his job, the justice system, and even his own community, Ethan must decide whether to step back or take a stand and lead a movement for real change. Will he fight the system or be consumed by it? Curious how it all unfolds. Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. The sun hung low over the city, casting long shadows across the streets as Ethan Carter moved through the crowd. Dressed in a plain brown shirt and faded blue jeans, he blended seamlessly into the sea of pedestrians. For a man whose life was built on blending in, this felt like just another day. But today's mission was supposed to be easy, routine even, surveillance, nothing more. His target was a suspected arms dealer, low profile but dangerous. Ethan had spent weeks gathering intel, weaving his way into the criminal network without raising suspicion. Now all that was left was to monitor the drop-off location and report back. It was the kind of assignment that required patience, something Ethan had in spades. Yet as he walked, he couldn't shake a feeling. Something was off. The city felt too quiet, too still. He checked his phone, scrolling through the messages from his team. All clear. No signs of trouble. But years of experience had taught Ethan to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him. He paused for a moment, scanning the street ahead. Nothing unusual, just regular people going about their day. He thought of Rebecca and the kids. His wife had been worried about this assignment. She always worried, especially when the job took him into dangerous territory. Ethan had reassured her, as he always did. "It's just surveillance," he had said, kissing her forehead before leaving that morning. "I'll be home by dinner." He'd meant it too, but as the minutes ticked by, he felt the weight of those words pressing on him. Something was coming. He just didn't know what yet. A few blocks away, Officer Luke Davis sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. He was restless. The shift had been dull, nothing more than a couple of traffic stops and one noise complaint, not exactly the action-packed day he had been hoping for. Beside him, his partner, Officer Kevin Wilson, leaned back in his seat, flipping through the report of a stolen bike from earlier in the day. "This is getting old," Luke muttered, glancing at the report. "Brown shirt, blue jeans. That's half the city." Kevin shrugged. "You never know. Could be our guy." Luke's eyes scanned the sidewalk, eager for something to break the monotony. That's when he saw him, a man in a brown shirt and blue jeans, walking purposefully through the crowd. He was looking around, but not in the casual way most people did. This guy seemed on edge, like he was hiding something. "Look," Luke said, nodding toward the man. "Fits the description." Kevin squinted. "Stolen bike? Doesn't seem like it." Luke's hand moved to the radio. "Doesn't matter. We've been sitting here all day doing nothing. Let's check him out." Kevin hesitated but then nodded. Luke pulled the patrol car to the curb, the engine purring as they slowed to a stop beside the man. Ethan heard the car pull up beside him, but he didn't react. He'd been in this position too many times to get spooked by a patrol car. He kept walking, eyes forward, blending in with the crowd. The mission came first. Stay focused. But then came the voice. "Hey you, stop right there!" Ethan's pulse quickened, but his face remained calm. His training kicked in. Don't escalate. Don't give them a reason to get suspicious. He slowed to a stop and turned toward the officers. They were young, probably new to the force, the kind that was itching for action. "Is there a problem, officers?" Ethan asked, his tone even and polite. Luke stepped out of the car, hand already resting on his holster. "We got a report of a stolen bike, and you matched the description. Brown shirt, blue jeans. Mind telling us where you've been?" Ethan blinked, surprised at the absurdity of the accusation. A stolen bike? Him? He couldn't afford to get involved in this. Not now. Not while he was in the middle of an undercover operation. "There must be some mistake," Ethan said, keeping his hands visible and his voice calm. "I'm just out for a walk." "Cut the excuses," Kevin said, joining his partner. "Hands where we can see them." Ethan slowly raised his hands, suppressing the frustration building inside him. He had been through worse situations, but the absurdity of this one gnawed at him. He couldn't let this escalate. Not here, not now. Listen, Ethan began, trying to keep his voice steady. I think there's been a misunderstanding. But Officer Luke wasn't interested in explanations. Turn around, he ordered, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. We're bringing you in. Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't let this happen. His cover could be blown, and if that happened, the entire mission was in jeopardy. But if he resisted, things could get much worse. The crowd around them had started to grow, people watching, recording on their phones. Ethan could feel their eyes on him, judging him. I'm a federal agent, Ethan said quietly. I'm on assignment. Luke laughed, a harsh, disbelieving sound. Yeah, right. And I'm the president. Kevin chuckled, moving closer. You think you can just say you're FBI and we'll let you go? Ethan clenched his jaw as he felt the cold steel of the cuffs snap around his wrists. His mind wasn't racing with fear. It was calculating, strategizing. But there was something else simmering beneath the surface. Anger. Anger that these officers weren't listening, that they were treating him like a criminal based on nothing more than his appearance. As they pushed him toward the patrol car, Ethan caught sight of the crowd. Their phones were still up, still recording. To them, he wasn't Ethan Carter, an FBI agent on a critical mission. He was just another black man being arrested by the police. Jessica Morgan had been sitting on a nearby bench when she saw the commotion. At first, she hadn't paid much attention. Just another routine police stop, she thought. But something about the way the officers were handling the situation felt off. They were too aggressive. The man wasn't resisting, yet they were treating him like he was dangerous. Instinctively, Jessica pulled out her phone and started recording. She had a bad feeling about this. She moved closer, trying to get a better angle without drawing too much attention. As she watched, the man, Ethan, she would later learn, tried to reason with the officers. He was calm, composed, but they weren't listening. Jessica had seen enough. She stepped forward, her phone still recording. Wait, she called out. The officers turned toward her, surprised. He didn't steal anything. I saw the whole thing. The real thief went that way. Ethan glanced at her, a flicker of hope crossing his face. But it was fleeting. He knew better than to rely on a stranger to defuse the situation. Luke, clearly irritated, waved her off. Ma'am, step back. We've got this under control. Jessica didn't back down. She raised her phone, showing the screen. I've been filming this. You're making a mistake. He didn't do anything. For a moment, the officers hesitated. Kevin glanced at the screen, then at his partner. Luke's jaw tightened, his grip on the situation slipping. Ethan could sense the shift in the air. They were starting to doubt, starting to realize they might have made a mistake. But would they admit it? Ethan's voice was calm but commanding as he spoke again. Check my inside pocket, he said, meeting Luke's eyes. You'll find my FBI credentials. Luke stared at him, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. You think we're just going to take your word for it? Ethan didn't blink. You'll find the proof in my jacket. Just check. Kevin, looking increasingly uncomfortable, finally stepped forward. Luke shot him a look, but Kevin ignored it. He reached into Ethan's jacket, pulling out a slim black wallet. He opened it, and his face went pale. Luke, Kevin whispered, holding out the wallet. He's telling the truth. Luke snatched the wallet, his arrogance faltering as he stared at the FBI badge inside. For a long moment, both officers stood frozen, their minds racing as they processed what they had done. They had just arrested a federal agent. Ethan felt the tension in his shoulders ease, but his mind was already racing. The damage was done. He had been publicly humiliated, handcuffed in front of a growing crowd, all while his critical undercover operation hung in balance. Luke's hands shook as he fumbled to unlock the cuffs. I'm sorry, he stammered, his voice barely audible. Ethan rubbed his wrists, his eyes blazing with restrained fury. You didn't listen, he said, his voice cold and cutting. I told you who I was, and you didn't listen. You saw what you wanted to see. The crowd around them was still watching, recording. Whispers rippled through bystanders, some expressing outrage, others murmuring in disbelief. The officers' faces were pale with embarrassment as they tried to salvage the situation. We thought, Luke began, but Ethan cut him off. You thought because I fit the description, because I was a black man in a brown shirt and jeans, Ethan said, his voice sharp. That was enough for you. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. Officer Kevin Wilson, who had been quieter throughout the interaction, opened his mouth as if to offer an apology, but no words came out. Luke's face flushed with frustration and embarrassment, but he remained silent, knowing there was no way to undo what had been done. As Ethan stood there, the full gravity of what had just transpired began to sink in. This wasn't just a personal injustice. It was a glaring example of the systemic biases that plague law enforcement. Biases he had seen all too often in his line of work. Just go, Ethan finally said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Get out of here. Luke and Kevin didn't need to be told twice. They hurried back to their patrol car, avoiding eye contact with the crowd as they pulled away, leaving Ethan standing in the middle of the street. He could still feel the eyes of the onlookers on him, but he didn't acknowledge them. Instead, he turned to the woman who had intervened. Jessica stood there, her phone still in hand, her face a mixture of concern and determination. Thank you, Ethan said, his voice softer now. Jessica nodded. I'm glad I could help, she replied. But this isn't over. They need to be held accountable for what they did. Ethan glanced at her phone. Knowing the video she had recorded was already on its way to going viral, he could feel the storm brewing, one that would drag him and those officers into the public eye. The next morning, Ethan woke to a flurry of notifications on his phone. The video of his wrongful arrest exploded across social media, quickly gaining traction and drawing attention from all corners of the internet. The hashtag number Justice for Ethan was already trending, with people sharing the video, voicing their outrage, and calling for action against the officers involved. Ethan scrolled through the messages, feeling a strange mix of emotions: anger, frustration, but also something unexpected: vindication. This was bigger than him now. His story touched a nerve, exposing a problem that went far beyond a single arrest. The public outcry was growing by the minute. As Ethan read through the comments, his phone buzzed with a call from Special Agent Robert Mitchell, his direct superior at the FBI. Ethan had been expecting this call. Ethan, Mitchell began, his voice steady but tense. I saw the video. We need to talk. I figured, Ethan replied, leaning back in his chair. What's the Bureau's stance? Mitchell sighed. The Bureau isn't happy about the attention this is bringing. We can't afford any missteps right now, especially not with the media circus that's forming around this. Ethan's jaw tightened. Missteps? I was wrongly arrested in front of a crowd. This isn't about a misstep. It's about systemic racism in law enforcement. I understand, Mitchell said, his voice more measured now, but we're under a lot of pressure. I'm advising you to keep a low profile, at least for now. Ethan knew what Mitchell was really saying. The Bureau wanted to distance itself from the controversy, to keep things from spiraling out of control. But Ethan wasn't interested in staying quiet. Not this time. I can't do that, Ethan said, his voice firm. I won't just let this blow over. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I figured you'd say that, Mitchell replied with a resigned sigh. But be careful. This could get a lot messier than it already is. After the call, Ethan's focus shifted to the news. Local reporters were already covering the incident, and the police department had announced a press conference later that day. Chief Richard Templeton would be speaking, and Ethan had a feeling it wasn't going to go well. By the time the press conference began, the police station was swarming with reporters. Ethan watched from the back of the room, blending in with the crowd. He wasn't interested in being the center of attention, but he wanted to hear what Templeton had to say. Chief Templeton stepped up to the podium, his expression calm and controlled. He was a seasoned leader, used to navigating difficult situations, but the pressure of this one was evident in the tightness of his jaw. Thank you all for being here, Templeton began, his voice measured. As you know, a video has surfaced showing a recent encounter between two of our officers and an individual who was mistakenly detained. The word mistakenly hung in the air, and Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Mistakenly? That wasn't the word for what had happened. We take these matters seriously, Templeton continued, and we have placed Officers Davis and Wilson on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Additionally, we will be reviewing our department's de-escalation training and policies to prevent incidents like this from happening in the future. The reporters murmured, jotting down notes, but Ethan could feel the growing frustration in the room. This wasn't enough, not by a long shot. One of the reporters raised their hand. "Chief, do you believe this incident was a case of racial profiling?" Templeton's expression tightened. "We are conducting a full investigation and will not jump to conclusions before the facts are known." Ethan could feel his blood boiling. This wasn't just about the facts. It was about systemic failures that allowed those officers to see him as a criminal first, rather than a man. He hadn't planned to speak, but before he could stop himself, he stood and called out from the back of the room. "With all due respect, Chief, this isn't just a mistake." The room fell silent. Every head turned toward Ethan. Templeton's eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, the chief looked taken aback. "This was racial profiling," Ethan continued, his voice rising with emotion. "Your officers judged me the moment they saw me, and they treated me like a criminal because of the color of my skin." The cameras whirred to life, capturing the confrontation. Templeton opened his mouth to respond, but Ethan wasn't finished. "I'm an FBI agent. I've served this country for over a decade, and your officers didn't care. They didn't listen. They saw a black man in a brown shirt, and that was enough for them." The tension in the room was palpable. Templeton, visibly flustered, tried to regain control. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, we are taking this matter seriously." "Not seriously enough," Ethan shot back. "Your department has a problem that goes beyond just 2 officers." Templeton's face reddened, and the room buzzed with reporters furiously typing notes. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment, knowing he had just escalated the situation beyond what anyone expected. But he didn't care. It was time someone said it out loud. The press conference had ignited a firestorm. Ethan's outburst was the headline of every major news outlet, his words replayed over and over as the debate around racial profiling and police misconduct intensified. The video of his arrest, combined with his powerful speech, sparked something much bigger than anyone had anticipated. But now the real battle was about to begin. Ethan knew that if he wanted to see real change, he couldn't rely on the police department's internal investigation. He needed legal action. That's when he reached out to Rachel Myers, a renowned civil rights attorney known for taking on high-profile cases involving police misconduct. Sitting in Rachel's office, Ethan laid out the events of the day, recounting every detail with the calm precision of someone trained to see things objectively. But even as he spoke, Rachel could hear the simmering anger beneath the surface. "I want to file a lawsuit," Ethan said firmly. "I want those officers held accountable, and I want this department to be forced to change." Rachel nodded, her sharp eyes focused on him. "You know this is going to get ugly, right? The department is going to fight this tooth and nail, and once you file, you'll be putting a target on your back." "I know," Ethan replied, his jaw set. "But I'm not backing down. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been in my position and didn't have a badge to protect them." Rachel smiled, a steely glint in her eyes. "Good. Then let's make sure we win." Together, they began preparing for the legal battle that would follow. Rachel filed the lawsuit, accusing the officers of racial profiling and unlawful detainment. The police department, predictably, responded by doubling down, defending their officers and insisting that the situation had been a simple misunderstanding. But with the video evidence and Ethan's status as an FBI agent, the department was quickly losing public support. Protests began to form outside the police station, demanding accountability and justice. Signs with slogans like "Stop Racial Profiling" and "Justice for Ethan" filled the streets, and the news cycle continued to cover the story around the clock. Rebecca watched the coverage from their living room, her face tight with worry. "Are you sure you want to keep going with this?" she asked one evening, her voice soft but filled with concern. "This is getting bigger than we ever imagined. I'm worried about you, about us." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He could see the strain this was putting on his family. The media attention, the constant scrutiny. It wasn't easy, but he knew he couldn't stop now. "I have to keep going," he said quietly, meeting her eyes. "If I back down now, nothing will change, and I can't live with that." Rebecca nodded, her expression conflicted. I know, just promise me you'll take care of yourself. We need you here too. Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I promise. But as the lawsuit moved forward and public pressure mounted, Ethan knew that the battle was only just beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the backlash began. Ethan's decision to go public with his story, combined with the lawsuit, had made him a lightning rod for both support and criticism. Messages poured in from all corners of the internet. Some were messages of solidarity and encouragement, but others were filled with hate and vitriol. People accused him of playing the race card, of trying to tear down good cops. Others sent more threatening messages, warning him to stop before things got worse. The noise was constant. His phone buzzed endlessly, and his inbox was flooded. At work, his colleagues in the FBI were polite but distant. The tension was palpable. Some supported his decision, but many were uncomfortable with the attention he was bringing to law enforcement. You're making waves, one of his fellow agents, Marcus, said quietly during a break. Big waves. Not everyone's happy about it. Ethan looked up from his desk, meeting Marcus's gaze. I know, but this isn't about making people happy. Marcus nodded slowly, but there was a shadow of concern in his eyes. Just be careful, man. The Bureau doesn't like controversy. It was a warning Ethan understood all too well. He had spent his career working within the system, playing by its rules. But now he was standing against that very system, and the consequences were starting to mount. At home, the strain was even more evident. Rebecca was doing her best to support him, but the tension between them was growing. Their kids, too young to understand the full extent of what was happening, could sense the stress in the house. Dinner conversations were tense, and the once easy rhythm of their lives felt fractured. One night, after putting the kids to bed, Rebecca found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his phone with a weary expression. She sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. You've done so much already, she said softly. Maybe it's time to take a step back. Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with exhaustion but also determination. I can't, Rebecca. If I stop now, it'll all fade away. People will forget, and nothing will change. Rebecca sighed, her fingers tightening around his arm. I just hate seeing you like this. I don't want this fight to destroy us. Ethan smiled weakly, though the weight of everything still pressed down on him. We'll be okay, he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. This is bigger than me. I have to keep going. As he sat there surrounded by the people he loved, Ethan realized just how high the stakes had become. This wasn't just about his case anymore. It was about a fight for justice that was bigger than any one person, and he wasn't going to walk away. Weeks of intense pressure weighed down on Ethan Carter. The lawsuit was moving forward. The media frenzy showed no signs of abating, and the constant backlash from critics and law enforcement circles took a heavy toll. Ethan, who had always prided himself on his resilience, began to feel the cracks. At work, the tension had escalated. His colleagues were polite, but the whispers behind his back had become impossible to ignore. Some saw him as a hero, standing up for a greater cause, but others, particularly those within law enforcement, viewed him as a traitor to brotherhood. Traitor, troublemaker, and race baiter were common refrains in the anonymous messages flooding his inbox. It wasn't the first time Ethan had been targeted for standing up for what was right, but this felt different. It felt more personal. Even his superiors had begun to show signs of distancing themselves from the public spectacle that his life had become. One day, after yet another terse conversation with Special Agent Robert Mitchell, Ethan found himself sitting alone in a coffee shop. He stared into his mug, feeling the familiar weight of isolation creeping in. The Bureau was advising him to keep things quiet. His friends were pulling away, and even at home things were tense. The thought crossed his mind. What if I just stop? What if he let it all go? What if he walked away from the lawsuit, from the media, from the protests outside the police station? He could go back to his old life, reclaim some semblance of normalcy. The system wasn't going to change overnight, after all. He was just one man. Maybe stepping back would be the best thing for his family, for his children. But just as the thought began to settle, he looked at the news feed on his phone. Another case of a black man wrongfully detained in a nearby city. The pattern was clear. The fight was far from over. Ethan closed his eyes, letting out a long breath. He knew the answer. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when so many were still suffering under the weight of a broken system. But he also knew that continuing down this path could cost him everything. Later that night, Ethan returned home, his mind clouded with the weight of his thoughts. He found Rebecca sitting in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating her face. She looked up as he entered, her eyes full of worry. "How was work?" she asked, her voice gentle. Ethan sat beside her, leaning his head back against the couch. "Tense. They want me to back off. Keep a low profile. Mitchell says the bureau's starting to feel the heat." Rebecca sighed, her hand resting on his arm. "I figured as much. It's getting harder to shield the kids from it too. People are talking, even at their school." Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't fully considered the effect all of this was having on his children. He had always thought he was fighting for a better future for them, but was he just making their present harder? "I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "I never wanted this to fall on you and the kids. I thought I could handle it all." Rebecca turned to him, her expression softening. "It's not your fault, Ethan. You're doing the right thing. It's hard. I see how much this is weighing on you, and it scares me." He looked at her, seeing the concern etched in her face. He had been so focused on the fight, on making sure that justice was served, that he hadn't realized how much he was carrying alone. "I almost thought about quitting today," he admitted, his voice low. "Just walking away from it all. For the kids." Rebecca's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't respond immediately. She just watched him for a long moment, and then, without a word, she reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I understand why you'd think that," she said softly. "But if you walk away now, what kind of world will we be leaving for them? You've come this far, Ethan. I know it's hard, but you're fighting for something bigger than us." Ethan swallowed, the lump in his throat tightening. Rebecca was right. The thought of quitting had been a moment of weakness, born out of exhaustion, fear, and the growing burden on his shoulders. But that burden wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been wrongfully judged, wrongfully detained, or wrongfully silenced. "You've always been stronger than me," Ethan said with a faint smile. Rebecca returned the smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "We're in this together, but I need you to promise me something." "What's that?" "Take care of yourself. Don't let this consume you. We need you here too, not just as a fighter, as a husband, as a father." Ethan nodded, pulling her closer. "I promise." The next morning, Ethan met with Rachel Myers in her downtown office. The law firm's walls were lined with framed photographs of past cases, each one a testament to her long career of fighting for justice. Rachel sat behind her desk, her sharp eyes focused on Ethan as he recounted the pressures he was facing. "You expected this, didn't you?" she asked, her voice calm but direct. "The system never fights fair." Ethan nodded, though the weight of her words still felt heavy. "I knew it would be hard, but I didn't think it would feel like this. So isolating." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're not alone in this fight, Ethan. There are others. People who've been through what you've been through. People who need your voice as much as you need theirs." She reached into her desk and pulled out a file. Inside were case reports, testimonies, and police records, each one detailing instances of racial profiling and police misconduct. "These are just a few of the people who've come forward since your story broke. They've been in your shoes, but they didn't have the platform you have." Ethan flipped through the documents, his heart sinking with each new story. There were so many, too many. Rachel's voice softened. "This isn't just about your case anymore. You've become the face of a movement, whether you like it or not. And now, we need to gather as many allies as we can." Ethan looked up at her, his resolve hardening. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next few weeks, Rachel and Ethan worked together to build a coalition. They reached out to victims of police misconduct, civil rights organizations, and activists who had been fighting for reform for years. Protests outside the police station grew larger, and the media began to shift its focus from just Ethan's case to the larger issue of systemic racism in law enforcement. One of the most powerful moments came when Ethan spoke at a rally outside City Hall. Hundreds of people had gathered, holding signs and chanting for justice. The air was thick with tension, but also with hope. As Ethan stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent, all eyes on him. "I never wanted to be here," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never wanted to be the face of this fight. But after what happened to me, I realized that I didn't have a choice. Because what happened to me is happening to people all over this country, every single day." The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes locked on him. "I've been in law enforcement for over a decade. I've seen the system from the inside. And I can tell you, it's broken, it's biased, and it's hurting people who look like me, who look like us, every day. And if we don't stand up and demand change, nothing will ever get better." The crowd erupted in applause, but Ethan wasn't finished. "This isn't just my fight," he continued, his voice rising. "It's our fight, and we need to keep pushing, keep fighting. Because if we stop now, if we let them silence us, nothing will change. And that's not a future I'm willing to accept." As the crowd roared in approval, Ethan felt a surge of energy wash over him. For the first time since his arrest, he felt like he wasn't standing alone. He was part of something bigger, something powerful, and that gave him the strength to keep going. Despite the growing support from the public and other victims, the pressure inside the FBI continued to mount. Ethan had always known that his decision to go public would come with consequences, but now those consequences are becoming more tangible. Special Agent Robert Mitchell called Ethan into his office one afternoon. The tension in the air was thick as Ethan sat across from his superior, waiting for the inevitable reprimand. "You've made quite a name for yourself," Mitchell began, his voice flat. Ethan remained silent, his expression unreadable. Mitchell sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Look, Ethan, I get it. I really do. You're fighting for something important, but you need to understand the position you're putting the Bureau in." Ethan's jaw clenched. "The position I'm putting the Bureau in? I was the one who was wrongfully detained. I'm the one who's fighting for justice. Why does that make me the problem?" Mitchell rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated. "It's not about right or wrong, Ethan. It's about optics. The Bureau is under intense scrutiny right now, and your case is making things worse. The higher-ups are worried about how this looks for us. They want you to step back, lay low until things blow over." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Blow over? This isn't going to blow over. I'm not backing down just because it's inconvenient for the Bureau." Mitchell let out a long sigh. "I figured you'd say that." There was a long pause, the silence hanging heavily between them. Finally, Mitchell leaned forward, his expression serious. "Look, I'll be honest with you. I respect what you're doing. I know this is bigger than just one case. But you need to be careful. You're walking a fine line here, and there are people in high places who aren't happy with the attention you're bringing." Ethan met his gaze, his voice steady. "I'm not backing down." Mitchell nodded, though there was a trace of sadness in his eyes. "Just know that whatever happens next, the Bureau isn't going to be able to protect you. You'll be on your own." Ethan stood, his resolve unwavering. "I understand." As he walked out of Mitchell's office, Ethan felt a strange sense of clarity wash over him. He had known from the beginning that this fight would cost him, but now he was prepared to pay that price. Because this was about more than just his career. It was about justice. It was about change. And no matter what happened next, he wasn't going to stop fighting. The day the trial began, the courthouse was surrounded by reporters, protesters, and supporters. The air was electric, charged with the tension of a city and a nation, waiting for answers. For weeks, Ethan's case had dominated the news, and now the legal battle was about to play out in front of the world. Ethan sat in the courtroom beside Rachel Myers, his attorney. Rachel had been meticulously preparing for this moment, determined to expose not just the actions of officers Luke Davis and Kevin Wilson, but the broader system that allowed racial profiling and misconduct to flourish unchecked. Ethan could feel her resolve as she shuffled through her notes, but his own nerves were harder to suppress. Across the aisle, the defense team representing the officers appeared confident. They had framed their narrative carefully. The officers had been doing their jobs, responding to a call about a stolen bike. They would argue that their actions were justified, that the situation had escalated because of miscommunication and misunderstanding. Racial profiling, they would claim, had nothing to do with it. But Ethan knew the truth, and so did the public, thanks to the viral video of his wrongful arrest. The judge entered, and the trial officially began. Rachel delivered a powerful opening statement, laying out the facts in a clear, compelling manner. She didn't just focus on what had happened to Ethan, but on the systemic failures that led to it. This wasn't just about one bad decision. This was about a pattern of behavior within law enforcement. The defense countered with a predictable argument. The officers had been acting on a legitimate report, and they had every reason to detain Ethan based on the description provided. They painted Ethan as an overly aggressive FBI agent who had escalated the situation by refusing to cooperate. It was, in their eyes, a simple case of misjudgment, not misconduct. But Rachel was ready. She had prepared meticulously, gathering evidence, testimony, and video footage that would show just how deeply this incident was rooted in racial bias. The trial was underway, and the stakes were higher than ever. The first day of testimonies was tense. The prosecution called several witnesses to the stand, including Jessica Morgan, the bystander who had recorded the video of Ethan's arrest. Jessica's testimony was crucial, and Rachel had prepped her thoroughly. Jessica took the stand, her expression serious but composed. She recounted the events of that day, explaining how she had noticed the officer's overly aggressive behavior toward Ethan and decided to record the incident. "I knew something wasn't right," Jessica said, her voice steady. "He wasn't resisting, but they treated him like he was dangerous. It didn't make sense to me." The defense attempted to discredit her, suggesting that she had been influenced by media coverage or that her video only captured part of the interaction. But Jessica held her ground, firmly stating that what she had witnessed was a clear case of racial profiling. "They didn't listen to him," Jessica said, her voice rising slightly with emotion. "They made up their minds the moment they saw him." Ethan watched from his seat, feeling a surge of gratitude for Jessica's courage. Her testimony, combined with the viral video, was a critical part of their case, but the trial was far from over. Next, the prosecution called Officer Kevin Wilson to the stand. Rachel had been looking forward to this moment. Wilson, the quieter of the two officers involved, had shown signs of discomfort during the arrest, and Rachel hoped to use that to her advantage. As Wilson took the stand, Rachel began her cross-examination with a calm, measured tone. She walked him through the events of the day, asking him to explain the rationale behind their actions. At first, Wilson stuck to the script, claiming that they had acted on a legitimate report and that Ethan had matched the description of the suspect. But Rachel wasn't satisfied. She pressed him further. "Officer Wilson," Rachel said, her voice growing sharper, "at any point during your interaction with Mr. Carter, did you stop to question whether he might not be the suspect you were looking for? Did you consider the possibility that you had the wrong man?" Wilson hesitated, his eyes flickering toward his partner, Officer Luke Davis, who sat rigidly beside his defense attorney. We were following procedure," Wilson said, his voice faltering. Rachel pounced on his hesitation. "Following procedure, or the following assumptions? You had no evidence that Mr. Carter had committed any crime, yet you handcuffed him in front of a crowd. Why?" Wilson shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He fit the description," he muttered. "The description of a man in a brown shirt and jeans," Rachel replied, her voice sharp. "That could have been anyone in the crowd that day. Yet you and your partner chose to arrest Mr. Carter. Why?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Wilson looked down, avoiding Rachel's gaze. He didn't have an answer. The tension in the room was palpable as the jury watched the exchange closely, absorbing every word. Rachel let the silence linger for a moment before delivering her final blow. "You made an assumption, Officer Wilson, an assumption based on Mr. Carter's appearance, and that assumption led to a wrongful arrest." Wilson didn't respond. He didn't need to. The damage was done. If Officer Wilson had been uncomfortable on the stand, Officer Luke Davis was downright combative. The more experienced and assertive of the two, Davis had been the driving force behind Ethan's arrest, and Rachel knew he would be more difficult to crack. Davis took the stand with a confident, almost defiant air. He was determined to defend his actions, and his testimony reflected that. He doubled down on their decision to detain Ethan, insisting that they had acted appropriately given the circumstances. "We had a report," Davis said, his voice firm. "We were responding to that report. Mr. Carter fit the description, and he refused to cooperate with us." Rachel raised an eyebrow. Refused to cooperate? Or did he try to explain who he was, and you didn't listen? Davis bristled at the question. He was being evasive. We didn't know who he was or what his intentions were. Rachel didn't let up. You didn't know who he was because you didn't check his credentials. He told you he was an FBI agent and you ignored him. Isn't that right? Davis glared at her, his confidence wavering. We didn't have any reason to believe him. People lie to the police all the time. Rachel took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. But Mr. Carter wasn't lying, was he? He was telling the truth. And instead of listening to him, you chose to arrest him based on nothing more than a vague description. Isn't that what happened, Officer Davis? Davis's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury watched him struggle to maintain his composure. Rachel pressed on. You judged Mr. Carter the moment you saw him, didn't you? You made assumptions about him based on his appearance, and those assumptions led to his wrongful arrest. Isn't that what happened? Davis remained silent, his face flushed with anger. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, and it was clear that Rachel had struck a nerve. The courtroom was completely silent as Rachel delivered her final question. Officer Davis, if Mr. Carter hadn't been a black man in a brown shirt and jeans, would you have treated him the same way? Davis's silence spoke volumes. The jury, the audience, and even the judge seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just about one man's arrest. It was about a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to continue for far too long. The most emotional moment of the trial came when Ethan himself took the stand. Rachel had prepared him for this moment, but nothing could have fully prepared him for the weight of speaking his truth in front of the court, the jury, and the world. As Ethan sat down and swore the oath, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his expression steady. This was his moment to tell his story, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been in his shoes. Rachel began the questioning gently, guiding Ethan through the events of the day he was arrested. He recounted the moments leading up to the arrest, the patrol car pulling up beside him, the officer's aggressive approach, and his attempts to explain who he was. I told them I was an FBI agent, Ethan said, his voice calm but filled with emotion. I told them I was on assignment, but they didn't listen. They didn't even check my credentials. They just saw a black man in a brown shirt and jeans, and that was enough for them. Rachel nodded, encouraging him to continue. How did that make you feel, Ethan? Ethan paused, the memory of that day heavy on his mind. It made me feel powerless, humiliated. I've spent my entire career working in law enforcement, protecting this country, and in that moment, none of it mattered. All they saw was the color of my skin. The courtroom was silent, every person hanging on his words. It wasn't just about me, Ethan continued, his voice growing stronger. This happens to people all the time. People who don't have a badge to protect them. People who are judged based on the way they look, rather than who they are. And if this can happen to me, a federal agent, then it can happen to anyone. Rachel gave him a small nod, signaling that he had made his point. But Ethan wasn't finished. I'm not here to get revenge, Ethan said, his voice steady. I'm here because this has to stop. This isn't just about two officers making a mistake. It's about a system that allows these mistakes to keep happening. And it's time for that system to change. As he finished speaking, the courtroom remained silent for a long moment. Then slowly, one by one, the members of the audience began to clap. It wasn't the loud roaring applause of a rally. It was the quiet, respectful acknowledgement of a truth that had been long overdue. Ethan had said what needed to be said. Now it was up to the jury. The trial had concluded, but the tension hadn't lifted. Instead, it had settled over the city like a storm cloud waiting to break. The jury had been sent to deliberate, and now all anyone could do was wait. Ethan sat beside Rachel in a quiet conference room, away from the cameras and reporters. The courthouse halls were filled with people speculating about the verdict, but inside this room, it was just him and Rachel. "How long do you think it'll take?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Rachel shrugged, leaning back in her chair. "It could be hours. It could be days. There's no way to know how long they'll deliberate, especially with a case like this." Ethan nodded, trying to shake off the nerves that were twisting in his stomach. He had never felt this vulnerable, despite everything he had gone through. He had stood in dangerous situations, undercover in high-stakes missions, but this felt different. This was personal. "What do you think they'll decide?" Ethan asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted an answer. Rachel paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "We've put forward a strong case. The video evidence is compelling, and the jury could see how this wasn't just a mistake. The officers made decisions based on assumptions, and those assumptions were rooted in bias." "But," Ethan asked, sensing there was more, "but this is a complicated issue," Rachel continued. "We're asking the jury to hold law enforcement accountable in a way that many people still find uncomfortable. It's a fight against a system that protects its own. There's a chance the jury might hesitate, or that some of them might sympathize with the officers." Ethan leaned forward, resting his face in his hands. "I don't know what I'll do if we lose," he muttered. "I don't know how I'll explain it to my kids if the system fails us again." Rachel reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've already done more than most people ever could, Ethan. No matter what happens, you've made an impact. The world is watching now. Change is coming. Slowly, maybe, but it's coming." Ethan nodded, trying to take some comfort in her words, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. He had come this far. Could they really lose? 2 days later, the jury reached a verdict. Ethan's phone buzzed with the notification, his heart leaping into his throat. The message was from Rachel, a short but urgent text. "They're ready. Verdict at 2 p.m. The hours leading up to the moment felt like an eternity. Ethan arrived at the courthouse, weaving his way through the throngs of reporters and protesters. The air was thick with anticipation. People lined the courthouse steps, holding signs that read, "Justice for Ethan and End Racial Profiling Now." The crowd had grown in size since the trial began, and now it felt like the entire country was watching. Ethan slipped into the courtroom, where Rachel was waiting for him. She greeted him with a firm nod, her expression unreadable. The room was packed, every seat taken, every eye focused on the front where the judge and jury would soon appear. The officers, Luke Davis and Kevin Wilson, sat with their defense attorneys, looking pale but composed. Ethan couldn't help but wonder what was going through their minds. Did they regret what they had done, or were they still convinced that they were on the right? Finally, the judge entered, calling the court to order. The jury filed in, their faces solemn. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Each beat a hammer against his ribcage. He forced himself to take slow, steady breaths, trying to stay calm. This was it. The foreperson of the jury stood, holding the verdict slip in their hands. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "We, the jury, find the defendants, Officer Luke Davis and Officer Kevin Wilson, guilty of violating Mr. Ethan Carter's civil rights through unlawful detainment and racial profiling." A wave of emotion crashed over Ethan. Relief, vindication, disbelief all at once. He had won. They had won. The courtroom erupted into a frenzy. Supporters clapped and cheered, while reporters scrambled to capture the moment. But Ethan sat still, frozen in his seat, trying to process the enormity of it all. The weight of the past weeks, the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, suddenly lifted, leaving behind a sense of profound exhaustion. Rachel leaned over, smiling slightly. "We did it," she whispered. Ethan nodded, his voice too thick with emotion to respond. Across the room, the defense attorneys huddled with the officers, who sat motionless, staring blankly ahead. The shock of their defeat was clear on their faces, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to feel any satisfaction in their suffering. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, about justice. As the judge dismissed the court, Ethan rose from his seat, turning to see the crowd behind him. His eyes found Rebecca's in the sea of faces, and she smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. Ethan walked toward her, pulling her into a tight embrace. For a moment, the world around them faded, and it was just the two of them, together. "You did it," Rebecca whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "You did it, Ethan." Ethan held her close, his voice barely a whisper. "We did it." The victory in court was sweet, but it wasn't the end. As Ethan had anticipated, the defense quickly filed an appeal, determined to challenge the jury's decision. The fight wasn't over yet, but this time, Ethan felt stronger. He had the verdict on his side and, more importantly, he had the support of a growing movement behind him. As the days passed, the news of the verdict spread far beyond the city. The video of the trial's conclusion, paired with Ethan's powerful testimony, went viral once again. Social media lit up with discussions about racial profiling, police reform, and the broader issues of systemic injustice that Ethan's case had brought to the forefront. Protests erupted in cities across the country, echoing the calls for reform that had begun outside the courthouse. People gathered with signs and chants, demanding accountability and change. What had started as one man's fight for justice had become a rallying cry for millions. Ethan, despite his victory, found himself caught in the whirlwind of media attention and public scrutiny. Reporters called him daily, seeking interviews, while civil rights groups reached out to offer their support and asked for his involvement in their efforts. His face was on the news, his name in headlines. But through it all, Ethan remained focused on the bigger picture. "Are you going to stay involved?" Rebecca asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset. The kids were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know. Part of me wants to step back, let others take the lead. But another part of me feels like I can't just walk away. There's so much more work to be done." Rebecca nodded, her hand resting on his arm. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you. Just remember, you don't have to carry this all by yourself." Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand. "I know, but I also know that if we don't keep pushing, nothing will change." The appeal process moved forward, and while it dragged on, Ethan and Rachel remained vigilant. The police department, under increasing pressure, began to implement reforms. Training programs were revamped, policies on racial profiling were updated, and a task force was formed to investigate other cases of misconduct. It wasn't enough, not by a long shot, but it was a start. One day, as Ethan was walking out of the courthouse after another hearing, he was approached by a young man. He looked nervous, clutching a piece of paper in his hand. "Mr. Carter," the young man said, his voice hesitant. Ethan turned, offering him a kind smile. "Yeah, that's me. Have I wanted to thank you?" the man said, his voice trembling slightly. "My brother went through something similar. He was arrested a few years ago, wrongfully detained, just like you. We didn't have anyone to fight for him, but after seeing your case, we're thinking about reopening his." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'm glad," he said quietly. "I'm glad you're fighting for him." The young man nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for standing up. You've given us hope." Ethan watched as the man walked away, feeling the weight of his words settle over him. This was why he had fought. This was why he couldn't stop. Because every victory, every step forward, gave someone else the courage to fight for justice. Months passed, and the country continued to grapple with the issues Ethan's case had brought to light. The appeal was eventually dismissed, solidifying the victory, but the conversation didn't end there. Ethan's case had sparked something much larger, a movement that refused to be silenced. Ethan became an unlikely figurehead for the fight against racial profiling and police misconduct. He was invited to speak at rallies, to participate in panels on criminal justice reform, and to advise on legislative efforts aimed at addressing the systemic issues he had encountered firsthand. At first, Ethan had been hesitant to embrace the spotlight, but over time he realized that his voice could make a difference. People listened to him, not because he was an FBI agent, but because he had lived through the injustice he was fighting to change. His story had resonated with millions, and that gave him a platform to push for real, lasting reform. Working closely with Rachel and other civil rights advocates, Ethan helped draft proposals for new legislation aimed at increasing police accountability and transparency. He met with lawmakers, spoke at congressional hearings, and even worked with the Department of Justice to launch a broader investigation into police misconduct across the country. The work was exhausting, and at times the progress felt slow, but Ethan remained committed. He knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight, but he also knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. Rebecca stood by his side through it all, her unwavering support giving him the strength to keep going. Their children, still young, were beginning to understand the significance of their father's fight, and Ethan took comfort in knowing that he was helping to build a better future for them. One evening, after a long day of meetings and calls, Ethan sat on the porch again, watching the sunset. The weight of the past months still pressed on him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. Rebecca joined him, sitting beside him and resting her head on his shoulder. "You've done so much," she said softly, her voice full of pride. "You've changed things." Ethan smiled, though there was still a hint of weariness in his eyes. "There's still so much to do." Rebecca nodded. "I know, but you've started something important, and you're not doing it alone." Ethan looked out at the world beyond their yard, a world that had changed because of his actions. The road ahead was still long, still difficult, but for the first time, he could see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we're just getting started." And with that, Ethan allowed himself to rest, knowing that the fight would continue tomorrow, but that for now, at this moment, he had earned a small victory. A victory for justice, for change, and for a future where no one would have to endure what he had. Months after the appeal was dismissed, the energy of the movement hadn't died down. If anything, it had intensified. People from all walks of life, activists, community leaders, even some law enforcement officers, began to join forces, determined to bring about meaningful change. Ethan Carter had unwittingly become a symbol of resistance, a rallying cry for those who had been fighting for justice long before his own case had ever gone viral. Ethan, despite his victory, found himself at a crossroads. He had started this fight because of a personal injustice, but now the cause was far bigger than just him. The national conversation around police reform was moving forward, and his name had become synonymous with it. As the public's attention shifted, lawmakers began to take notice, and the whispers of reform turned into tangible legislative efforts. One evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table poring over documents, he received a call from Special Agent Robert Mitchell. The two hadn't spoken much since the trial, and Ethan was surprised to see Mitchell's name flash on the screen. "Ethan," Mitchell began, his voice as steady as ever, "I wanted to reach out because there's something I think you should know. The Bureau's been paying attention to everything you've done, and there's talk of offering you a leadership role in a new civil rights task force." Ethan sat back in his chair, momentarily stunned. "A task force?" "Yeah," Mitchell confirmed. "It would focus on investigating police misconduct and civil rights violations across the country. We need someone with your experience, someone who knows both sides of this fight. You'd be in charge of a lot of the oversight. It's a real chance to make a difference." The offer hit Ethan like a wave. It was the kind of opportunity he'd never imagined, one where he could have a direct hand in reforming the very system that had wronged him. But with the weight of the opportunity came hesitation. Returning to the FBI, even in this new role, would mean stepping back into a system that had, in some ways, failed him. Could he trust it? "I need to think about it," Ethan said, his mind racing. "I figured you'd say that," Mitchell replied. "Just know that the door is open." After the call, Ethan walked out onto the porch, the cool night air doing little to settle his thoughts. He found Rebecca sitting there, her expression calm but curious. "What was that about?" she asked. Ethan explained the offer, laying out the details of the task force and the potential impact it could have. Rebecca listened, her eyes searching his face for the answer he hadn't yet found himself. "Do you want to do it?" she asked when he had finished. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "It's a huge opportunity. I could help fix things from the inside, make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. But to go back to the Bureau, after everything that's happened, I'm not sure I can." Rebecca leaned forward, taking his hand. "You've always fought for what's right, Ethan. Whether you're inside the system or outside of it, you'll keep doing that. But this could be a chance to make real change. to build something better. Ethan looked out at the darkened sky, weighing her words. She was right. This was an opportunity to shape the future of law enforcement in a way that few people ever got. But could he trust the system to allow him to make those changes? And even if he could, was he ready to return to the institution that had nearly destroyed him? Over the next few days, Ethan couldn't shake the weight of the decision hanging over him. He consulted with Rachel Myers, whose legal expertise had guided him through so much of this fight. She had her own take on the offer. This could be a way to push for reforms from the inside, Rachel said. But you have to go in with your eyes open, Ethan. The system's not going to change overnight, and you'll face resistance from people who don't want things to change. Ethan nodded, knowing she was right. That's what I'm worried about. I don't want to end up a figurehead, someone they can point to and say, look, we're doing something, without actually doing anything. You'd have to make sure that doesn't happen, Rachel replied. But you've got a powerful voice now. They can't just ignore you. Ethan spent hours going back and forth, imagining the different paths ahead of him. He could stay where he was, continuing to push for reform as an advocate and public speaker, working with activists on the ground. Or he could take the FBI's offer, putting himself back in the thick of it, working from within the system to root out the problems he had spent the last year fighting against. The decision weighed heavily on him, but as each day passed, he found himself leaning toward one answer. It wasn't an easy choice, but it felt right. Finally, after days of contemplation, Ethan picked up the phone and called Mitchell. I'll do it, Ethan said, his voice steady. I'll take the task force job. There was a pause on the other end before Mitchell spoke. You sure about this? Yeah, Ethan replied, feeling a surge of resolve. I am. Good, Mitchell said, because we've got a lot of work ahead of us. Ethan's new role as the head of the FBI's Civil Rights Task Force wasn't easy, but it was exactly what he had expected. Challenging, frustrating, and often disheartening. But it was also a place where real change was possible. The task force was tasked with investigating civil rights violations, including cases of police misconduct and racial profiling. And Ethan was determined to make sure their work had teeth. His first few weeks in the role were a whirlwind of meetings, policy briefings, and strategic planning. He built a team of investigators, some from within the FBI and others brought in from civil rights organizations. Ethan made sure to surround himself with people who were just as committed to reform as he was, people who wouldn't be afraid to push back against the system when necessary. One of his first major cases involved a police department in a mid-sized city where complaints of racial profiling had been piling up for years. Ethan led the investigation himself, reviewing body camera footage, interviewing victims, and working with local activists who had been fighting for accountability long before the task force had arrived. The deeper he dug, the more corruption he uncovered. Officers who had been accused of misconduct multiple times but never disciplined, a department culture that dismissed complaints of bias as overreactions, and a leadership that seemed more interested in protecting its reputation than protecting its citizens. Ethan's work with the task force wasn't just about individual cases, though. He pushed for broader reforms within law enforcement agencies across the country, advocating mandatory bias training, increased transparency, and stronger oversight mechanisms to hold officers accountable when they cross the line. It was slow progress, but it was progress, and every small victory felt like a step in the right direction. Despite the success of the task force, Ethan knew that real change wouldn't come without a fight, and that fight arrived sooner than he expected. Several months into his new role, a high-profile case involving the fatal shooting of an unarmed black man by a police officer brought national attention back to the issue of police brutality. The officer in question had a history of complaints against him, and the local community was outraged that he had been allowed to remain on the force. The task force was called in to investigate, and Ethan immediately found himself facing immense pressure from all sides. Activists demanded swift justice, while law enforcement unions and police departments pushed back, claiming that the officer had acted within the bounds of his training. As the investigation unfolded, Ethan uncovered damning evidence that the officer had indeed violated protocol and had acted with reckless disregard for the victim's life. But as he prepared to release the findings, he was met with resistance from within the FBI and from political leaders who were worried about the potential fallout. Maybe we should slow this down, one senior official suggested during a tense meeting. We need to think about how this will affect morale within law enforcement. If we go after this officer too aggressively, it could lead to more unrest. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had seen this before. People in power were more concerned with maintaining the status quo than with delivering justice. We can't slow down, Ethan said, his voice firm. This officer killed an unarmed man. We have evidence. If we don't act, we're telling the world that police officers are above the law. The room fell silent, the weight of Ethan's words hanging in the air. After a long pause, the senior official sighed. All right, we'll move forward. The task force released its report, and the officer was charged with manslaughter. The community erupted in both relief and anger. Relief that justice was being served, but anger that it had taken so long to hold someone accountable. The case marked a turning point for the task force. It proved that they were willing to take on even the most difficult cases, and it sent a message to law enforcement agencies across the country. The era of unchecked power was over, but the backlash was immediate. Police unions launched a campaign to discredit Ethan and the task force, accusing them of being anti-police and undermining public safety. The criticism was fierce, and it took a toll on Ethan. He received threats, and the pressure mounted every day. Rebecca stood by him through it all, offering words of support and reassurance during the darkest moments. But she could even see the toll it was taking. You're doing the right thing, she said one night as they lay in bed. Don't let them make you doubt that. Ethan smiled weakly, but the exhaustion in his eyes was clear. I just want to make things better, but sometimes it feels like it's not enough. It is enough, Rebecca said firmly, because you're doing what so many people have been too afraid to do. The years that followed were filled with more battles, both won and lost. But the changes that Ethan and the task force pushed for slowly began to take hold. Departments across the country started implementing the reforms they had fought for, and more officers were held accountable for misconduct than ever before. Ethan's work wasn't done. He knew it never would be. But he had helped spark a movement, one that had changed the national conversation around law enforcement and civil rights. The system was still far from perfect, but it was better, and that, for now, was enough. One evening, after a long day at work, Ethan returned home to find his family gathered around the dinner table. The smell of a home-cooked meal filled the air, and the sound of his children's laughter brought a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. Rebecca smiled at him from across the room, her eyes filled with pride. How was work? She asked. Busy, Ethan replied with a grin, sitting down beside her. But good. As they ate, Ethan allowed himself to relax, enjoying the simple pleasure of being with his family. For so long, he had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, fighting for justice and change. But now, sitting at the table with the people he loved most, he realized that the fight had been worth it. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better, and that was a victory in itself. Years later, Ethan Carter stood on a stage, looking out at a crowd of hundreds. It was a ceremony honoring the work he had done with the FBI's Civil Rights Task Force, and the room was filled with activists, community leaders, and law enforcement officials who had come to celebrate the progress they had made together. Ethan stepped up to the podium, his heart full as he prepared to address the crowd. He had given countless speeches over the years, but this one felt different. This one felt like the culmination of everything he had worked for. I didn't set out to become a symbol, Ethan began, his voice steady. I didn't ask for this fight, but sometimes the fight chooses you, and when it does, you have to rise to meet it. The crowd listened intently, their eyes fixed on him. We've come a long way, Ethan continued. We've made progress, but we're not done yet. The fight for justice, for equality, for accountability, it's ongoing. It's a fight that we all have to continue together. He paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I've seen what we can accomplish when we refuse to back down, when we refuse to accept things as they are. And I know that together we can build a better future. A future where justice isn't just a word, it's a reality. The room erupted into applause, and as Ethan stepped back from the podium, he felt a deep sense of peace. He had done his part. The fight would continue, but he knew that the next generation would carry it forward. As he walked off the stage, Rebecca and their children met him at the side, their smiles warm and full of pride. Ethan hugged them tightly, knowing that everything he had fought for was worth it. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, he felt hopeful for the future. A future where justice, equality, and accountability weren't just ideals to strive for, but realities to be lived. And that, for Ethan Carter, was the greatest victory of all. Thank you for following Ethan Carter's powerful journey to justice and systemic change. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on future stories. Your support helps keep these narratives alive, and we've got more compelling tales coming your way. Thank you for reading, stay tuned, and remember, together we can make a difference.